The crystalline sound of her laughter cut through the din of the crowded cafe, striking Quinn Oliver with unexpected force. He froze, coffee halfway to his lips, his attention suddenly and completely diverted from the financial reports on his tablet. It wasn't just a laugh, it was pure, unfiltered joy, like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and it reached into some forgotten corner of his soul. Quinn scanned the cafe until he found the source. A young woman with chestnut hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders, seated at a corner table with an elderly woman who must have been her grandmother. Something the older woman had said had triggered that magical sound, and the younger woman was still smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sir, was there something else you needed?" The barista's voice snapped Quinn back to reality. "No, thank you," he replied, leaving a generous tip before gathering his things. As the 34-year-old shipping magnate who had built Oliver Maritime from a single vessel into an international fleet, Quinn was accustomed to commanding attention, not being captivated by it. Yet as he settled at a table with a clear view of the laughing woman, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her in a way that both intrigued and unsettled him. The woman who he would soon learn was named Julia Nash laughed again, and Quinn felt something inside him shift. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to be distracted by anything other than his empire. Not since his father had died and left him the failing family business at 24 had he truly let himself experience joy. Julia and her grandmother eventually stood to leave, and Quinn watched as she helped the older woman with her coat. The care and tenderness in her gestures spoke volumes about her character. Before he could think better of it, Quinn found himself standing, intending to introduce himself, but the crowded cafe suddenly filled with a tour group, blocking his path. By the time he navigated through the throng, Julia and her grandmother had disappeared. Quinn returned to his table, telling himself it was for the best. A man in his position couldn't afford distractions. Yet for the rest of the day, that laugh echoed in his mind, a melody he couldn't forget. The following morning found Quinn returning to the same cafe, telling himself it was the excellent coffee that drew him back, not the slim chance of seeing the woman with the musical laugh again. The place was quieter today, mostly filled with people working on laptops or reading books. Quinn ordered his usual black coffee and settled at the same table as yesterday, opening his tablet to review the quarterly projections for his shipping fleet. His company was thriving, expanding rapidly across Asia and Europe, but success had come at a price. His personal life was practically non-existent. His penthouse apartment felt more like a hotel room than a home. "Julia, your latte's ready," the barista called out, and Quinn's head snapped up so quickly he nearly spilled his coffee. There she was, walking to the counter. Today she wore a navy blue blazer over a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked professional but approachable. Quinn watched as she thanked the barista with a warm smile before turning to leave. Quinn's mind raced. He needed to say something, anything, but what? He wasn't usually at a loss for words, having negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, yet the prospect of speaking to this woman made his palms damp. As luck would have it, fate intervened in the form of a business call. His phone rang loudly, drawing Julia's attention. Their eyes met briefly as Quinn apologized and answered the call. By the time he finished dealing with the crisis at one of his European ports, she was gone. Quinn cursed his timing. Twice now, he'd let her slip away. But Oliver men weren't quitters. His father had taught him that much before he died. If there was a chance Julia was a regular at this cafe, he would keep coming back until their paths crossed again properly. For the next week, Quinn adjusted his schedule to spend his mornings at the cafe. His executive assistant, Margaret, was puzzled by his sudden insistence on working remotely for the first few hours each day, but Quinn had built his empire by being decisive. When he wanted something, he pursued it with unwavering determination. On the 6th day, his persistence paid off. Julia walked in shortly after 9, this time alone. She ordered her latte and found a table near the window, pulling out a sketchbook and set of pencils. Quinn watched, fascinated as she began to draw, her face a mask of concentration. Taking a deep breath, Quinn approached her table, coffee in hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally formal even to his own ears. "I couldn't help but notice your artwork. Are you an artist?" Julia looked up, startled at first, then offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm an architectural designer, actually. These are just preliminary sketches for a project. May I?" Quinn gestured to the empty chair across from her. She hesitated before nodding. For a moment. "I'm expecting someone soon." Quinn sat down, extending his hand. "Quinn Oliver." "Julia Nash," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. If she recognized his name and most people in business circles did, she gave no indication of it. "What kind of project are you working on?" he asked, genuinely curious. Julia turned her sketchbook slightly so he could see. The drawing showed a building that seemed to curve and flow organically, unlike the rigid skyscrapers that dominated most cities. "It's a community center for a neighborhood revitalization project," she explained, a hint of passion entering her voice. "The area needs a gathering place that feels welcoming and accessible, not institutional." "It's beautiful," Quinn said sincerely, struck by the thoughtfulness of the design. "Very different from most public buildings." "That's the point," Julia replied, and there it was, that laugh, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Most public architecture fails because it prioritizes making a statement over making people comfortable." Quinn found himself leaning forward, genuinely engaged. "I've never thought about architecture that way before, but it makes perfect sense. Buildings should serve the people who use them, not just the egos of those who commission them." Julia's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by his insight. "Exactly. I'm trying to." "Julia, sorry I'm late." A middle-aged man in a tweed jacket approached their table, looking curiously at Quinn. "Professor Walsh, this is Quinn Oliver," Julia introduced them. "He was just asking about my community center design." Quinn stood, shaking the professor's hand. "I should let you get to your meeting. It was nice meeting you, Julia." As he turned to leave, Julia called after him. "Do you come here often, Quinn? I haven't seen you before last week." Quinn smiled, pleased she had noticed him too. "I'm discovering it has much to recommend it. The coffee is excellent." "Yes," Julia agreed with a small smile. "The coffee." Quinn returned to his table, feeling more alive than he had in years. As he watched Julia and her professor discuss her designs, he was already planning his next move. The following day, Quinn arrived at the café earlier than usual, bringing with him a folder containing information about a property his company had recently acquired for redevelopment. It was meant to be luxury condominiums, but after meeting Julia, he'd started to reconsider the plans. Julia arrived at her usual time, today wearing a sage green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. Quinn waited until she had ordered before approaching her. "Good morning, Julia," he greeted her. "I was hoping I might run into you again." Julia smiled, seeming genuinely pleased to see him. "Quinn, right? The coffee connoisseur, among other things," he admitted. "I actually have a proposition for you if you wouldn't mind hearing me out." Julia raised an eyebrow, her expression suddenly guarded. "What kind of proposition?" Quinn quickly realized how his words might have sounded. "A professional one. I'm in shipping primarily, but my company also invests in real estate development. We recently acquired a waterfront property that was going to be converted into luxury apartments, but after seeing your work yesterday, I'm reconsidering the plans." Julia's wariness gave way to curiosity. "What did you have in mind?" "That's just it, I'm not sure yet," Quinn said honestly. "But I know the city needs more than just another exclusive residential tower. I'd like your perspective on what might work better for the community." Julia studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine his sincerity. That's not typically how developers approach projects. Usually, it's all about maximizing profit per square foot. "I've found that doing the right thing often leads to success in the long run," Quinn replied. Would you be willing to take a look at the site? No commitment, just a professional consultation. Julia laughed that enchanting sound that had first caught Quinn's attention and shook her head in amusement. You're not what I expected from a businessman. Quinn sensed she had almost said billionaire but had chosen a more neutral term, so she did know who he was after all. Is that a yes? He pressed gently. I'll think about it, Julia countered, taking a sip of her latte. I'll need to see the location details and current plans first. Quinn slid the folder across the table. Everything's in there, including my contact information. Take your time. Their fingers brushed as Julia accepted the folder, and Quinn felt an electric jolt at the brief contact. From the slight widening of Julia's eyes, he wondered if she'd felt it too. I should warn you, Julia said as she tucked the folder into her bag. I don't sugarcoat my professional opinions. If I think your project is harmful to the community, I'll tell you so. Quinn smiled, admiring her directness. I'd expect nothing less. Honesty is refreshing in my world. And what world is that exactly? Julia asked, her head tilting slightly. I know you're Quinn Oliver of Oliver Maritime. Your net worth is supposedly somewhere north of $3 billion. What I don't know is why someone like you is suddenly interested in community-focused architecture. Quinn appreciated that she'd laid her cards on the table. Fair question. The truth is, I've been successful beyond anything I imagined when I took over my father's struggling shipping company 10 years ago. But lately, I've been thinking about legacy, about making a positive impact beyond just creating shareholder value. And this epiphany just happened to coincide with spotting me in a cafe. Julia's tone was skeptical, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Not exactly, Quinn admitted. Hearing your laugh was what initially caught my attention. It reminded me that there's more to life than balance sheets and board meetings. Meeting you and seeing your work just gave shape to thoughts that were already forming. Julia blushed slightly, clearly not expecting such candor. My laugh, it's quite distinctive, Quinn said. In a good way. Julia seemed unsure how to respond to the personal turn in their conversation. I should go. I have a client meeting in 30 minutes. Of course, Quinn stood as she gathered her things. I hope to hear from you about the project. You will, Julia promised, slipping her bag over her shoulder. One way or another. Quinn watched her leave, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. He was used to being in control, to knowing the outcome of negotiations before they began. But with Julia Nash, he was in uncharted territory. 3 days later, Quinn's phone rang as he was reviewing shipping manifests in his downtown office. The number wasn't one he recognized. Quinn Oliver, he answered, his tone professional. Mr. Oliver, it's Julia Nash. Her voice was formal, giving nothing away. I've reviewed your waterfront property plans. And, Quinn asked, spinning his chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor where several of his ships were currently docked. I'd like to see the site in person before giving you my assessment. Are you available tomorrow afternoon? Quinn quickly opened his calendar, seeing a board meeting scheduled for that time. I can make myself available. Shall we meet there at 2? That works, Julia agreed. Text me the exact address, and Mr. Oliver? Yes, this is strictly professional. I want to be clear about that, Quinn smiled to himself. Of course, Miss Nash, I wouldn't have it any other way. The following day, Quinn arrived at the waterfront property 15 minutes early, wanting to collect his thoughts before Julia arrived. The site was impressive 5 acres of prime waterfront land with stunning views of the bay. The previous owner had gone bankrupt during development, leaving behind half-finished structures that Quinn's company had planned to demolish for the luxury condominium project. Quinn heard the sound of a car pulling up and turned to see Julia stepping out of a modest sedan. Today, she wore jeans, boots, and a practical jacket, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked ready for a construction site tour, not a business meeting, and Quinn found this practicality endearing. Miss Nash, he greeted her with a smile. Thank you for coming. Mr. Oliver, she returned with professional courtesy, but her eyes were already scanning the property with keen interest. This is quite a location. It is, Quinn agreed, leading her toward the site. The previous owner envisioned a resort-style condominium complex with private marina access. Julia nodded, taking in the partially constructed buildings and the sweeping shoreline. And you were planning to continue with that vision? It seemed the most profitable use of the space, Quinn admitted. Until recently. They spent the next hour walking the property, with Julia asking pointed questions about zoning restrictions, environmental considerations, and community needs. Quinn was impressed by her thoroughness and the way she seemed to be mentally redesigning the space as they walked. What do you think? He finally asked as they stood at the edge of a small pier, looking back at the property. Julia took a deep breath, her expression serious. Honestly, I think another luxury development would be a wasted opportunity. This city has enough exclusive spaces that wall off the waterfront from regular people. Quinn nodded, unsurprised by her assessment. What would you suggest instead? Julia turned to face him, her eyes alight with possibility. A mixed-use development that combines affordable housing, public green spaces, and community facilities. Maybe some local businesses on the ground floor, a public promenade along the water. As she spoke, gesturing animatedly, Quinn found himself captivated not just by her vision but by her passion. This was a woman who believed in making the world better through her work, a value he'd once held himself before the pressures of running a global corporation had narrowed his focus to profits and expansion. You're thinking I'm naive, Julia said, misinterpreting his thoughtful silence. Not at all, Quinn assured her. I'm thinking you're inspiring. The question is whether such a project could be financially viable. It could be with the right approach, Julia countered. There are tax incentives for affordable housing, grants for public space development. The goodwill alone would be valuable for your company's image, Quinn laughed softly. You've clearly done your homework on me and my company. Julia shrugged unapologetically. I like to know who I'm dealing with. And what have you concluded? Quinn asked, genuinely curious about her impression of him. That you're at a crossroads, Julia said thoughtfully. You've built an empire, but now you're wondering if it was worth the personal sacrifices. This project could be your way of reconnecting with what matters beyond business success. Quinn was startled by her insight. That's remarkably perceptive. I'm good at reading spaces, Julia said with a small smile. Sometimes that extends to the people who create them. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the waves lap against the shore. Finally, Quinn made a decision. I'd like you to design this project, he said. Not as a consultant, but as the lead architect. Whatever you envision for this space, I want to make it happen. Julia's eyes widened in surprise. That's not what I was expecting when I agreed to come here today. Is that a no? Quinn asked, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. It's an I need to think about it, Julia replied. This would be a massive undertaking, and I'd need assurances that your commitment to a community-focused approach is genuine. What kind of assurances? For starters, a legally binding agreement that a significant percentage of the housing will remain affordable in perpetuity, Julia said firmly. And community involvement in the planning process. Quinn nodded, respecting her priorities. I can agree to those terms. Anything else? Julia hesitated before adding, and clarity about our working relationship. I need to know this isn't just. I mean, I'm flattered by your interest, but Julia, Quinn interrupted gently. I am interested in you personally, I won't deny that. But this project offer stands regardless. Your talent and vision are what this space needs. Julia studied his face, seemingly searching for any sign of insincerity. Okay, she finally said. Send me a formal proposal and I'll consider it. Thank you, Quinn said sincerely. And perhaps, once you've made your decision about the project, we could discuss the other matter over dinner. Julia's laugh, that wonderful, melodic sound, rang out across the water. You're persistent, I'll give you that. I prefer determined, Quinn corrected with a smile. It served me well in business. We'll see if it serves you equally well in personal matters. Julia replied with a hint of challenge in her voice. As they walked back to their cars, Quinn felt more hopeful than he had in years. Whether or not Julia accepted his project offer or his dinner invitation, she had already given him something invaluable. A reminder of what it felt like to be passionate about possibilities rather than just profits. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. After careful consideration, Julia had accepted the role as lead architect for the waterfront project, which they were now calling Harbor Commons. She had assembled a team of designers and community planners, and Quinn had been impressed by the thoroughness of their approach. They had also, tentatively, begun to explore the personal connection between them. Their first dinner had been slightly awkward, both of them more comfortable discussing architecture and business than revealing personal details. But by the third dinner, they had found an easy rhythm, discovering shared interests in historical architecture, sailing, though Julia's experience was limited to small recreational boats, not the massive cargo vessels Quinn owned, and a mutual love for old jazz music. My grandmother introduced me to Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong when I was just a kid, Julia explained one evening as they walked along the waterfront after dinner. That's why I take her to that café every week. It was where she used to go with my grandfather when they were young. So that day I first heard you laugh. Quinn began. She was telling me about how my grandfather once spilled an entire milkshake on himself trying to impress her, Julia confirmed with a smile. Some of my happiest memories are of hearing their love stories. They sound like remarkable people, Quinn said sincerely. I'd like to meet your grandmother sometime. Julia glanced at him with surprise. You would, of course, Quinn replied. She's important to you, so I'd like to know her. Julia stopped walking and turned to face him. You're nothing like I expected, Quinn Oliver. Is that a good thing? He asked, gently taking her hand in his. I'm still deciding, Julia teased, but she didn't pull her hand away. As the project progressed, Quinn found himself more involved than he had been in any development before. He attended community meetings, listened to residents' concerns, and worked closely with Julia to ensure the final design would truly serve the neighborhood's needs. The preliminary designs Julia presented were extraordinary, a harmonious blend of public and private spaces that would transform the waterfront into a vibrant community hub while preserving natural elements and creating affordable housing opportunities. The central plaza will connect directly to the waterfront promenade, Julia explained during a presentation to community stakeholders. We've designed it to host farmers markets, cultural events, and everyday gatherings. Quinn watched from the back of the room, filled with pride not just in the project but in Julia herself. She commanded the room with quiet confidence, addressing questions with patience and insight. This was a woman who understood that buildings were more than structures, they were spaces where lives unfolded. After the meeting, as they gathered their materials, Quinn noticed Julia looking unusually pensive. Everything okay? He asked. The presentation went brilliantly. It did, she agreed, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Quinn, I need to ask you something important. Of course, he said, instantly concerned by her serious tone. If this project hadn't come along, if we hadn't met professionally, would you still be interested in me? The vulnerability in her question was palpable. Quinn set down the models he was carrying and took both her hands in his. Julia, the first time I saw you, I didn't know you were an architect. I was captivated by your laugh, by the joy it conveyed. Everything since then, getting to know your brilliant mind, your compassionate heart, your unwavering principles has only deepened that initial attraction. Julia searched his eyes, as if looking for any hint of insincerity. I just needed to be sure this isn't about the project. It's not, Quinn assured her. The project is important, but you, he paused, realizing the magnitude of what he was about to say, but knowing it was true. You've become essential to me. Julia's expression softened and she squeezed his hands. You're becoming pretty essential to me too. It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the depth of their feelings, and Quinn felt a surge of hope. That evening, when he kissed her goodnight at her door, it held the promise of something lasting. As summer turned to fall, Harbor Commons began to take physical shape. The groundbreaking ceremony attracted local media attention, particularly given Quinn Oliver's reputation as a hard-nosed businessman now championing community-focused development. "Mr. Oliver," one reporter called out as Quinn and Julia stood together at the site, "many are surprised by your shift towards social responsibility." "What prompted this change in direction?" Quinn glanced at Julia, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. "Sometimes," he said, looking back at the reporter, "we need to be reminded of what truly matters. This project represents not just a development, but a belief that business success and community well-being can go hand in hand." "And Miss Nash," another reporter asked, "how does it feel to have one of the world's wealthiest men backing your vision?" Julia smiled diplomatically. "What matters isn't Mr. Oliver's wealth, but his willingness to listen to community needs and commit to addressing them. That kind of partnership is what makes transformative projects possible." Their professional rapport was as strong as their personal connection, which had deepened over the months. Quinn had indeed met Julia's grandmother, Margaret, who had sized him up with shrewd eyes before declaring that he might just do for her granddaughter. Coming from Margaret, Julia assured him later, this was high praise indeed. For Quinn, who had lost both his parents and had no siblings, being welcomed into Julia's close-knit family was both unfamiliar and deeply moving. He found himself looking forward to their Sunday dinners at Margaret's house, where family stories flowed as freely as the wine. One particularly memorable evening, as Quinn helped Margaret with the dishes while Julia took a business call, the older woman fixed him with a penetrating look. "You love her, don't you?" she asked bluntly. Quinn didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do, very much," Margaret nodded, satisfied. "Good. Julia deserves someone who appreciates her for everything she is, not just what she can do professionally." "I couldn't agree more," Quinn replied sincerely. "She's changed how I see the world." Margaret smiled knowingly. "That laugh of hers hooked you from the start, didn't it?" "It's her father's laugh, my son, had the same musical quality to it. When Julia laughs, it's like having a piece of him back." Quinn was touched by the confidence. "It was the first thing I noticed about her. I heard it across a crowded cafe and couldn't get it out of my head." "Some sounds stay with you forever," Margaret said softly, handing him a plate to dry. "My husband's voice is still clear as day in my memory, even 15 years after losing him." "You had a good marriage?" Quinn asked. "The best," Margaret confirmed. 52 years of adventure, challenges, and joy. The secret is simple. Choose someone whose happiness matters more to you than your own." Quinn pondered her words long after that evening, recognizing the truth in them. Julia's happiness had indeed become central to his own well-being. He found himself making decisions both personal and professional with her in mind. Not from obligation, but from a deep desire to see her thrive. As winter approached, and the first structures of Harbor Commons began to rise from the foundations, Quinn made a decision. With Margaret's blessing and assistance, he planned a surprise that would hopefully mark the beginning of their next chapter together. On a crisp December evening, Quinn invited Julia to the Harbor Commons site, telling her he wanted to show her something important. "It's freezing out here," Julia protested good-naturedly as they walked along the newly constructed promenade, her hand tucked securely in his. "What couldn't wait until morning?" "Patience," Quinn advised with a smile, leading her toward a section of the development that would eventually become a public garden. Now, in the darkness, it was illuminated by thousands of tiny white lights strung through the temporary structures, creating a magical canopy overhead. Julia gasped at the sight. "Quinn, it's beautiful." "But what's the occasion?" In the center of the space stood a small table with a bottle of champagne chilling and 2 glasses. Next to it was a display board covered with a cloth. "I wanted to show you the latest revision to the plans," Quinn explained, leading her to the table and removing the cloth with a flourish. Julia looked at the unveiled drawing, confusion crossing her features. It showed the central plaza of Harbor Commons, but with one significant addition. A custom-designed bench overlooking the water, engraved with words she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "What does it say?" she asked, leaning closer. Quinn gently turned her to face him, then dropped to one knee, taking her hand. "It says, where Quinn Oliver first told Julia Nash he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her." Julia's free hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "Julia," Quinn continued, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart, "before I met you, I thought success meant building the biggest company, accumulating the most wealth. You showed me that true success lies in creating something meaningful, in making a positive difference." Your laugh caught my attention, but your heart, your mind, and your spirit are what made me fall completely in love with you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring box, opening it to reveal an elegant emerald-cut diamond set in platinum. "Will you marry me, Julia? Will you build not just Harbor Commons with me, but a life together?" For a moment, Julia stood speechless, tears welling in her eyes. Then that magical laugh bubbled up joy in its purest form, and she pulled Quinn to his feet. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you, Quinn Oliver." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her into his arms for a kiss, Quinn knew with absolute certainty that hearing Julia's laugh in that cafe months ago had been the most fortunate moment of his life. It had led him not just to a better version of his business, but to a better version of himself, one who understood that the true measure of wealth wasn't in bank accounts or assets, but in love, purpose, and the sound of shared laughter echoing across the years to come. Quinn and Julia married the following spring in a ceremony overlooking the harbor, with Margaret beaming proudly from the front row. Harbor Commons was completed a year later to widespread acclaim, setting a new standard for community-focused development. Quinn established a foundation to replicate the model in other cities, with Julia heading the architectural vision. And every anniversary, they returned to that same cafe where it all began, where a billionaire had overheard a laugh and found his heart awakening to possibilities he'd never imagined. Sometimes the smallest moments, Quinn reflected as he watched his wife's face light up with laughter across the table, truly did change the course of a life forever.